Everyone knows the man under the spotlight. The sunglasses. The gold jackets. The impossible vocals. The dance moves that somehow make an entire stadium move with him. But there is another Bruno Mars. The little boy who learned that performing wasn't simply something you did for fun. It was something you did to survive. Before millions of people knew his name, Bruno was already learning one of the hardest lessons in entertainment. The applause can disappear overnight. And that's what makes his story so unusual. Because Bruno Mars didn't grow up as an ordinary kid who discovered music one day and decided to become famous. Music was around him before he was old enough to understand what fame even meant. He was performing as a child, standing in front of crowds while most kids his age were still figuring out who they wanted to become. Then came the part nobody could have predicted. The family act disappeared. The money disappeared. The stability disappeared. And suddenly, the little performer who had once lived around stages and music had to experience something completely different. Struggle. But that struggle would become one of the most important chapters of his life. Because when you grow up believing the stage is your home, losing it can feel like losing part of yourself. Bruno had a choice. He could walk away, or he could chase the dream until the world finally had no choice but to notice him. He chose the second. And what happened next would take him from sleeping wherever he could, to becoming one of the biggest performers on the planet. But before the awards, before the records, before the millions, there was a kid trying to figure out how to keep going. And that is where Bruno Mars' real story begins. Imagine being 4 years old and already understanding what it feels like to perform for an audience. For Bruno Mars, the stage wasn't some distant dream. It was childhood. While other children were spending their early years playing, Bruno was learning songs, watching performers, copying movements, and developing the instincts that would eventually become his signature. His family was deeply connected to music, and Bruno became a part of that world almost immediately. People began noticing something unusual about him. He wasn't simply cute and style. He had presence. That little boy confidence became a part of the performer he would eventually become. And the more he performed, the more comfortable he became in front of people. But there was a hidden cost. When a child grows up performing constantly, the line between childhood and career can become almost impossible to separate. There is no real off switch. The audience expects another show. The family depends on the performance. And the child learns to deliver. Again. And again. And again. That discipline would later become one of Bruno's greatest strengths. Years afterward, he would be able to walk onto enormous stages and make tens of thousands of people feel like he was performing directly to them. That ability didn't appear overnight. It was trained into him when he was still incredibly young. But then, just as Bruno was becoming comfortable with the life he knew, everything changed. His parents divorced. The family act ended. And suddenly, the stage that had been such a huge part of his childhood was no longer guaranteed. For a young Bruno, this wasn't just the end of a performance. It was the beginning of uncertainty. The lights were disappearing. The money was disappearing. And the future suddenly looked completely different. But Bruno wasn't finished. In fact, the hardest chapter of his childhood was only beginning. This is the part of Bruno Mars, a story that changes the way you look at the superstar. Because being the polished suites and sold-out arenas was a period when stability was anything but guaranteed. After his parents' divorce, the family situation became difficult. The entertainment world that had once provided structure was gone, and Bruno experienced the kind of uncertainty that most people never associate with a future global superstar. There were moments when money was tight. There were moments when home didn't feel permanent. And there were moments when Bruno had to understand something very young. Talent doesn't guarantee security. That lesson matters. Because it's easy to look at a successful person years later and imagine that success was inevitable. It wasn't. There was no guarantee Bruno would become a superstar. There was no guarantee a record label would want him. There was no guarantee anyone would listen to his demos. There was only a kid who knew he loved performing. So he kept working. He took whatever opportunities he could find. He performed. He practiced. He studied other artists. And he learned how to turn limitations into motivation. That period also gave Bruno something that money can't buy. Perspective. He knew what it felt like to have a very little. He knew what rejection felt like. And perhaps most importantly, he knew what it felt like to lose something before you were ready to let it go. Those experiences would later appear indirectly in the way he wrote music. His songs could be glamorous, romantic, playful, or extravagant. But underneath them was often a performer who understood loneliness, heartbreak, ambition, and insecurity. And then came the decision that would change everything. Bruno was still young. He could have stayed home. Instead, he went to Los Angeles and didn't arrive as a superstar. He arrived as another unknown musician trying to convince somebody that it mattered. And Hollywood was about to teach him another painful lesson. Los Angeles sounds glamorous when you hear the name. Hollywood. Recording studios. Famous producers. Big opportunities. But imagine arriving there without fame. No established career. No guaranteed contract. No army of people waiting to help you. Just a dream and the belief that you can somehow make it work. That was the world Bruno Mars entered. He was young, ambitious, and determined. But determination doesn't automatically open doors. The music business is full of talented people who never get their chance. Bruno quickly discovered that. He struggled to find his place. He took whatever work he could. He moved through difficult living situations. He searched for opportunities. And eventually, a record label gave him a chance. It looked like the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. Finally, someone had recognized his potential. But there was a problem. They didn't completely understand what to do with him. The industry wanted something specific. A particular sound. A particular image. A particular type of artist. And Bruno didn't fit neatly inside that box. The ideal eventually disappeared. No major release. No instant career. Just rejection. For someone who had already sacrificed so much, that kind of failure could have been devastating. But something strange happened. The rejection forced Bruno to stop waiting for someone else to define him. Instead of asking, what kind of artist do they want? He began asking a much more important question. What kind of artist do I want to become? That change in mindset was everything. Bruno started focusing on songwriting and collaboration. He worked with other musicians. He studied records. He learned how hits were constructed. And slowly, something began happening. The man who couldn't get a record deal started helping other artists create hits. Nobody knew it yet. But Bruno Mars was about to become successful before he ever became famous. Here is the irony of Bruno Mars' career. One of the failures that could have ended his dream eventually became a part of the reason he succeeded. After struggling to establish himself as a solo artist, Bruno began working behind the scenes. He wrote, he produced, he collaborated, and he learned. This was not glamorous. There were no screaming fans. No giant stadiums. No headlines announcing his arrival. But Bruno was developing something much more valuable. He was learning how to create songs people couldn't forget. Instead of depending entirely on someone else to give him a chance, he became useful to the people who were already making music. And that changed his position. Suddenly, Bruno wasn't simply asking for an opportunity. He was bringing something to the table. Songs, hooks, melodies, ideas. His collaborations began attracting attention. Other artists were releasing songs that Bruno had helped create, and those songs were succeeding. The strange part? Millions of people were hearing Bruno's work without necessarily knowing Bruno. That is one of the most overlooked stages of a superstar's journey. Before the audience learns your face, they might learn your sound. And Bruno's sound was becoming difficult to ignore. It was proving that he could write songs that connected with people. That mattered because when his opportunity finally came, he wasn't entering the music industry as an inexperienced newcomer. He had already spent years learning the game from the inside. He understood songwriting. He understood performance. He understood what made people remember a chorus. And now he had something else. Confidence. The rejection had forced him to develop. The struggle had forced him to work. And the years behind the scenes had prepared him for the moment when the spotlight finally turned toward him. Then came the song that changed everything. And suddenly, the industry wasn't asking who Bruno Mars was. Everyone wanted to know what he would do next. When Bruno Mars stepped into the spotlight as a solo artist, he already had something most new artists spent years trying to build. proof. He had written. He had collaborated. He had watched songs become hits. He knew what worked. But now came the real test. Could make people care about Bruno Mars himself? The answer arrived faster than almost anyone expected. His early music introduced a performer who didn't seem interested in choosing just one identity. It could be romantic. It could be funny. It could be vulnerable. It could be flashy. And most importantly, it could perform. That combination was powerful. The audience wasn't simply listening to songs. They were watching a character develop. Then came the records. One successful song became another. The attention grew. Awards followed. The name Bruno Mars became impossible to miss. But the most important thing wasn't simply that the songs were successful. It was that Bruno was proving he could survive different musical eras. Pop chant, radio chant, streaming chant, audience task chant. And somehow, Bruno kept adapting without losing the personality that made him recognizable. That is much harder than it sounds. Many artists become successful because they perfectly match a moment. But when the moment disappears, their popularity disappears with it. Bruno's career began moving differently. He could borrow from older musical styles while making them feel modern. He could take inspiration from soul, funk, pop, R&B, rock, and retro sounds without making the result feel like a history lesson. And that became his advantage. He wasn't trying to sound like the past. He was using the past to create something new. Teneto can even be her risk. Instead of simply repeating what had already worked, Bruno decided to push his sound further. And that decision would create one of the biggest eras of his career. Success creates a dangerous temptation. Repeat yourself. If one formula works, use it again. If audiences love one sound, give them more of it. But Bruno Mars seemed to understand the opposite principle. The bigger became, the more freedom he wanted. That became especially clear when he began experimenting with different sounds and styles. Rather than staying inside one musical category, he leaned into the influences that shaped him. Funk soul, R&B, pop, disco, rock. The result was music that could sound nostalgic and fresh at the same time. And that was the trick. Bruno wasn't simply copying old records. He was recreating the feeling of an era while giving it modern energy. That approach produced some of his biggest moments. But there was a deeper reason it worked. People weren't just hearing a song. They were being transported. A beat could make you feel like you had walked into an old nightclub. A melody could remind you of music you heard years ago. A performance could make a massive arena feel intimate. That's the power of nostalgia when it's used correctly. And Bruno understood it. His attention to detail became almost obsessive. The sounds, the arrangements, the choreography, the clothes, the instruments, the stage design. Everything had a purpose. It wasn't simply releasing tracks. It was building experiences. And eventually, that philosophy created something even bigger. A partnership that looked like a side project at first. Two performers. One retrovision. A completely different identity. Silk Sonic. And when Bruno and Anderson Paak joined forces, they weren't used making another album. They were trying to make people believe they had traveled backward in time. And somehow, they made it work. When Silk Sonic appeared, the music industry already knew Bruno Mars was capable of making hits. But this was different. The entire concept felt like an experiment. Could two modern artists create music that genuinely captured the warmth, personality, and theatricality of classic soul and R&B? The answer came through the music. The songs felt smooth, warm, playful, romantic. But beneath the nostalgia was meticulous production. This wasn't an accidental throwback. It was carefully designed. The performances felt like a conversation with another generation of musicians. And that was exactly why people connected with it. Silk Sonic didn't simply remind listeners of older music. It reminded them of a time when the singer, the band, the musicians and the performance all felt like part of the same event. That distinction mattered. Because modern music is often consumed through headphones and short clips. Silk Sonic felt built for a room, for a stage, for people watching performers interact with each other. And Bruno's ability to create that atmosphere became one of his greatest strengths. He understood that a hit don't always need to be complicated. Sometimes it needs personality. Sometimes it needs a groove. Sometimes it needs two artists having fun. And then came the awards. The recognition. The massive audience. The performances that turned into viral moments. But even after reaching that level, Bruno continued experimenting. He collaborated with artists from completely different musical worlds. And the H-Time. The same question returned. How far can Bruno's sound travel before it stops sounding like Bruno? That question became especially interesting as he entered new collaborations. Because the bigger the artist becomes, the harder it is to surprise people. Bruno had already done pop, funk, R&B, soul, retro music, stadium performances. But the next chapter would show something else. His biggest challenge might not be musical at all. It might be personal. For years, Bruno Mars built a career around performance. But there is a difference between performing for millions of people and allowing millions of people into your private life. Bruno has generally kept that boundary tighter than many celebrities. And that creates a strong situation. The less a celebrity reveals, the more people speculate. Fans notice small details. A missing photograph. A chant appearance. A quiet moment. A relationship rumor. A comment. And suddenly, an entire story can grow around something that might have been meaningless. This is where Bruno's public image becomes fascinating. The audience knows the performer extremely well. But the private man remains much harder to understand. That gap creates mystery. And mystery is powerful. It makes people ask questions. Who is Bruno when the music stops? What does he worry about? What does he regret? What does fame cost him? And how much of his real life ever reaches the public? These questions became even louder when rumors began circulating about his personal relationships and alleged gambling problems. Some stories spread quickly online. Others were repeated by media personalities. But there is an important distinction between a viral claim and a confirmed fact. A dramatic number can make a story irresistible. A celebrity supposedly owing millions sounds like the perfect headline. But without reliable evidence, the headline is still used a claim. And Bruno's story shows exactly why that distinction matters. Because once a rumor becomes popular, correcting it becomes much harder than creating it. People remember the accusation. They don't always remember the denial. And yet Bruno's response to controversy has often reflected the same quality that helped him survive rejection. Humor. Instead of allowing every rumor to define him, he has sometimes turned attention into part of the performance. But being the jokes is a serious reality. Being famous means losing control over your own story. And that might be the hardest prize of all. So after everything, who is Bruno Mars? Is he the superstar in the gold jacket? The songwriter behind the hits? The performer who can walk onto a stage and control an entire stadium? Yes. But that's only the surface. The deeper story is about a kid who learned very early that success can disappear. A young musician who experienced rejection. An artist who spent years working behind the scenes. A performer who had to prove himself before the world was willing to listen. And perhaps that is why Bruno's performances feel so controlled. Because behind the confidence is preparation. Behind the showmanship is repetition. Behind the smile is experience. He learned the stage when he was young. He learned failure when he was trying to become an adult. He learned patience when the industry ignored him. And he learned that sometimes being rejected isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it is the beginning of the right one. That is the part of Bruno Mars' journey that numbers can't explain. Awards can measure success. Charts can measure popularity. Streams can measure attention. But none of those numbers explain why someone keeps going when nobody is watching. Bruno did. And that's what makes his story connect with people who haven't ever stepped onto a stage. Because almost everyone understands what it feels like to be underestimated. To hear no. To wonder if the dream is actually worth the sacrifice. And then to keep going anyway. The world eventually saw Bruno Mars as a superstar. But before the world knew his name, there was simply a young performer trying to survive long enough to become the person he believed they could be. And maybe that's the real secret behind the success. The spotlight didn't create Bruno Mars. The years before the spotlight did. And every time walks onto a stage today, that history walks out with him. The applause might last a few minutes. The performance might end. The lights might go dark. But the journey that created him never really leaves. Because before Bruno Mars became a superstar. He became someone who refused to stop.